Good afternoon. Hey, Melanie, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Can you hear
I
me?
guess
Am I
not.
cutting out? I can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Well, this is
Can you
Dr.
hear
Brent
me?
Irby. I'm here again with Melanie Inglis for episode 4 of The Hard Truth. And this week we're going to talk a little bit or a lot of bit about police misconduct, right? It's a
Yeah,
subject that you and I are very familiar with for a lot of reasons. Um,
absolutely.
Yeah. Can you tell us your sort of I want anybody to think that you're trying to put yourself out there as the preeminent expert on these subjects. You're giving you're learning, you're going through the process of becoming essentially a forensic professional, and you're doing our residency program and you're learning things as you go, but you have your own history and your own experience with law enforcement in this regard. Can you just kind of give us the kind of contact that you've had and the kind of experience you've had in this regard, where what you're drawing from when you're thinking about and talking about this subject? Because I think people will be very interested to know.
Yeah, sure. There's a few different areas. Of course, I'm learning more right now about it within casework, working with you and going through the actual cases and seeing the investigations done from a forensic perspective. In
Right.
my history, I've dealt with law enforcement through the recruitment process, through ride-alongs. I've been within their community and seen and heard things that I then clarified with other officers. This wasn't just from one or two. I would then go out and ask around different services to see if these things were actually happening or if this was a one-off here and there with
Right.
people who just had questionable ethics. Didn't seem to be the case. Also with Please Bring Me Home, so we work cold case missing
Yes.
person cases, and there is a lot that I learned through that with misconduct and investigations and the complete disregard for some of the people, again, based on some of these things that I want to dive into a little bit later, that
Yes.
represent the ethics and things like that.
So very well put. And I want to make this very clear, right up front, that police misconduct it can be broken down into two parts, but the word misconduct does not imply administrative. It usually is used that there's a criminal charge that's called official misconduct, and that's actually a crime. A lot when anytime a law enforcement officer violates their oath or violates their policies and procedures or violates their professional ethics, they can actually be charged with the crime of misconduct, of official misconduct. So you have this behavior that can occur, and it may or may not be criminal, but it certainly can be charged criminally. So we use this term misconduct, and very often people get the idea that it's not that serious or that it's not that big of a deal. The reason we're focusing on law enforcement is because law enforcement is the gateway for all of our investigations, right? They're the ones who are in
Mhm.
charge, they have the statutory authority and obligation to actually investigate crime, to detain and interview suspects and witnesses, and to basically secure and process crime scenes to collect evidence and submit it for testing. They have that sole obligation and authority. No one else has that legal authority, just them. And because that's true, they have a responsibility to be properly trained, to know their protocols, to have good ethical standards, and not to be willing to lie in documents or in court.
Right.
the, the rest of us are just along for the ride, as it were, when it comes to what they're supposed to do. So we have to vote. We're not doing it to be mean. We're doing it because it's necessary so that we can continue to get good information and evidence upon which to base our forensic findings, right? I mean, let's talk just for a second from your perspective, it's my perspective. What's your perspective on why you think this is an important subject to discuss publicly?
This, I would say, it's an important topic, absolutely, because this is something that's happening. It's happening everywhere. We do see a lot of these things coming out of the US via the media, but in Canada, we don't see it as much broadcasted to the public. And I find that these are situations that are going unnoticed. People don't understand what's happening, and then we're getting into missing person cases, and we're dealing with families, and all of these things are
Right.
happening, and nobody's doing anything about it, and everyone's just left to say, well, I guess that's what it is. Because, like you said, law enforcement are the people that have the authority to do that. They need to be doing their job and they need to be trained properly in order for these things to actually progress properly. But that's
That
not what's happening. It's not happening anywhere.
And there's a blackout essentially in the way that the media in Canada approaches these cases, right? They're not, the
Yes.
reason these incidents don't get widely reported or disseminated is precisely because the law almost prohibits it in a lot of ways, right?
Hmm. That's
So
right.
in the
And
United
then
States, we don't have the problem.
no, and so we see a lot of it. If anybody is paying attention to the media around the world, they are aware of these situations. But then it hits. It's just like people will see it and I'll go, well, that's terrible that that's happening there. Well, it's
Yeah.
happening here. You're just not aware of it because the media isn't allowing you to be aware of it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right. What I have found is that there's different kinds of media, but I spent you'll laugh at this a little bit, but I got a contact from somebody who wanted to do an interview with me about a case I'd worked on about 20 years ago, this rape homicide of this teenage girl, and this person presented themselves as a person with the media, and I'm like, oh, this is a very interesting case that I worked on a long time ago, and I would love to talk to the media about it. I think it deserves some attention because the public has a right to know certain things that occurred in the case.
Hmm.
And it got almost no attention. Although there was a documentary made about that case that didn't involve me. It only involved the prosecutor from the case, who had committed all manner of misconduct, and their forensic professionals committed all manner of misconduct. And so this person contacted me. Come to find out, they're not a journalist. They have a blog, and they don't know how to do
Oh,
research. They're one of those people who sits around and they like to talk about cases and sort of smack their chops over extremely violent sexual crimes. And she's like in her 70s, and she had no idea any of the dimensions or parameters of the case, the involvement of law enforcement. She was asking me basic questions that she could just answer with a simple Google search about
hmm.
the role of law enforcement, about what's going on in the forensic science community. She seemed blissfully unaware of the state of forensic science, of things like the NIS report. But my point is, you can have professionals. You can have most people are not aware of the state of forensic science and the problems that we're having there. They're certainly not aware of the problems with law enforcement and law enforcement misconduct. And if they are aligned with one of those communities, they willfully blind themselves to what's going on.
Hmm.
They get actually very defensive if you start talking about law enforcement or the prosecution in a way that is not screaming at the top of your lungs that you are a patriot, that they are patriots, and that they are heroes. It is,
Hmm.
the word I would use is pathetic. It is a pathetic need for hero worshiping that exists to protect them from any real scrutiny. Criticism is required as part of our constitutional obligation. Criticism is required as part of your obligation as a citizen to not accept what you're given without asking questions. That's what criticism means. It doesn't mean, oh, we're just saying bad things. It means we're not going to accept what we're told without doing
Hmm.
some fact checking. That's what it means. And most of the people who are journalists now are not really journalists. They're not fact checking anything. What they're doing is they're publicizing press releases that exalt the heroism of law enforcement or whatever. And it's caused real damage to the criminal justice system because it prevents us from asking certain questions. So I'm very much attenuated to that. I'm very with you with that. And I'm such a bad person. I spent an hour or more on the phone with her explaining that what she was doing was immoral. That's how horrible I am. But I mean, it
I
was
don't think you're
absolutely
horrible.
well, not for that
Probably
reason.
needed to be done.
No, it did. It was because she
Hmm.
did not understand that what she was doing was causing harm to the community by repeating things that weren't true.
Hmm.
But she's writing a book. Apparently, she's writing a book about this, about some cases that are covered
Read the
by a
case.
documentary series. And what she's doing is a review of how great this show does at their effort to create a fair and balanced picture of these cases. And they
You
don't.
know,
And
on
you're
No,
good.
and on that point, with our some of our cold case missing person cases, we have lots of people that are reaching out, and like you said, they're not qualified to be
No.
collecting any information, and they're researching everything based on their opinion that they have, whether it's a subconscious
Yes.
opinion that they're not even aware of, or they're just trying to build a case to say that they're right. They're building it to say, nope, I am right on all of this, and this is why. And then when they'll reach out to one of us at Please Bring Me Home, and we're telling them something that may contradict what they're saying, and it's immediately shut down because we aren't, it's not that we are against law enforcement. We are trying to work side by side with them, and they keep stopping it because they don't want us involved. We're not going over any laws. We're not doing anything
Right.
illegal. We're both out for the same purpose. From my perspective, we both want
Yeah.
to bring people home, right? We want to solve these cases.
I
But
guarantee you that's not the mission from the law
well,
enforcement side.
and this is where I started to learn this. At first, when I came into this, I thought they're going to love this. We have all of
Yeah,
these
we can
things that
help.
we can help them with. We can take
Yes,
this off their plate without asking them about their
yes,
investigation because we don't get those notes, right? But no,
right.
it's shut down every time. And unless we are siding with them,
Yeah.
then we're the problem. And then everyone tries to silence us,
Okay.
right?
It's ego and PR. The only way to get a law
Mhm.
enforcement agency to take action on something that doesn't fit with their ideological stance on an issue is to make them look bad in the public, in
Yeah.
the media. That's the only way. Otherwise, they won't respond, won't react. But they'll do crazy, ridiculous things that satisfy a political need, which is a huge problem. So, what I wanted to mention is that I don't usually spend that much time trying to explain to somebody that what they're doing is bad. But if they have a broad reach and they're going to write a book and they're going to put themselves out
Yeah.
there, I mean, I will take the time to educate them because
Hmm.
not just because you have a thought as a citizen. This is the problem with criminology. Just because you have a thought as a citizen about something, you think you're an expert. And this is a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about a little bit today because it's going on in my country. And just so you know, today I am in the great state of Texas. Will be filming a documentary for a Netflix series on something that I'm doing tomorrow. But we arrived a couple days earlier so we could get situated and make sure we had time for our podcast today. So this
So
is
fancy.
it is so fancy. It's so good.
So fancy.
It only sounds fancy. It's not. I do these things every once in a while. It's you're just trying to educate and trying to teach, and it's all good. So what's going on right now in the United States that's being broadcast live on most major news networks is the Ahmaud Arbery case. This is a 25-year-old black male in Georgia who was jogging, as was his morning practice, near his home, unarmed, without a cell phone, without anything on his person, did it all the time. And he was identified by a father and a son. This name, what is it? Greg and Travis Michael, a father-son team. They saw him jogging by, and the problem is they're white. And the problem with white people is that too often they see black people in their neighborhood or their community, and it makes them viscerally upset. This is not just latent racism. This is overt racism. If you see a black person running by, you should be thinking there's a person running by. Instead, they're thinking there's a black person running by. Therefore, they must be doing something wrong because that black person doesn't belong in my white community. So what did they do to make their fears real? They collected weapons and they got into their pickup truck and they drove him down. And a neighbor joined him. What was the neighbor's name? I can't remember the neighbor's name off the top of my head. But a neighbor joined him. And this neighbor was videoing everything with his cell phone, recording everything with his cell phone. They confronted him, and when he ran away, they shot him with a shotgun and killed him.
Mhm.
Right, live on the camera, right there. The police were called, and the first call that the father made, that Greg Michael made, was to the DA's office, the local DA's office. Want to know why?
He
Because
knew someone there.
worse than that, he had just retired from there. He was a former
Right.
DA investigator, and he called the district attorney first before anything else. And of course, he was not arrested, and he was not searched for anything, and they didn't document things properly. And the crime scene investigators testifying today, and she wasn't told to do stuff, and it's a shit show of epic proportions. But in the period of time, in the months that went over, the months that transpired between the incident on February 23rd, 2020, and the arrest of these three individuals, is that the video was leaked online. That video going online made the public furious because it contradicted a lot of things that had been said publicly by these guys. And they ultimately had to be arrested. That's not the best part for me. The best part for me is that last month, the prosecutor, her name is Jackie Johnson, District Attorney Jackie Johnson. She was actually arrested. She was indicted and arrested for interfering with a law enforcement investigation and violating her oath of office. These are misdemeanor charges, but it's not a small thing because what she did was she obstructed the investigation and she put the word out that these guys were to be protected. She took selfies with them. She was like, these guys, you got to understand, these guys were heroes to the white community. These guys are heroes to the white community. The reason we know this is because they reflect the values that are in that community, but also You can look on social media and see how many people from that state and from other surrounding states share the same attitudes and beliefs that if you got a black man running, this is indicative of somebody who's done something wrong, and
Was
that is
this the
a death
was
sentence.
this the video that was leaked? I read the article that you sent to me. I'm just wondering, was this the video that was leaked where the man who was shot was in the middle of the street and people were standing around him and nobody went up to check his vitals
That's
for
right.
like 10 or 20 minutes or something like that?
You got to
And there
understand.
was video all over the place, body cams, everything.
This is not a new thing. This is the way we are now as a society in the United States. We are a society of watchers and bystanders who don't, I mean, we don't have any real ethics that I can tell. We don't have any real morality that I can tell. What we do is we sit and we watch situations to see if we can record them for our advantage in some way. We're not interested in helping people. We're not interested in even being good people or even policing crime. That's not what's going on here. This was a public,
Mm-hmm.
violent, murderous lynching of a black man in broad daylight by three guys who almost got away with it. If it had not been recorded and that recording had not been leaked to the embarrassment of law enforcement, I very much doubt that these guys would be on trial, especially in Georgia, which is easily one of the most one of the states that's got one of the most dense populations of historic racism ever. I'll give you an example. If you go to Georgia, what you're going to find is a lot of Confederate flags everywhere. A lot of really overweight people with a lot of Confederate flags. That's what you're going to find. And that's not their fault. They're overweight. It's because of bad diet, bad food, bad, food deserts and poverty and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this problem. And you ask them, well, why Confederate flags? Why this? Why that? Why would you do that? Why would you align? Oh, it's cultural and it's about being a Southern gentleman or Southern hospitality, or it's about Southern whatever. It's about our history and culture. No, the Confederate flag and all the on the lawns of most of the courthouses in Georgia, you will, or not in Georgia, excuse me, in the South, you will find monuments to the Confederate War. So if you're a black person on trial, you're going into the courthouse, you're going to see a Confederate War monument on the courthouse lawn when you go in. That's what you're going to see. You're going to see monuments to all these Confederate war heroes. When did those get put up? Right after the Confederate War? Or after the Civil War? No, they got put up in the 60s by the Klan, by the Ku Klux Klan, who organized all the money to put those up in response to Martin Luther King's civil rights activism around the nation.
Wow.
So this was done in the 60s. So this culture and context is not some old historical thing. It's actually part of the culture and context of the old people that exist today. The people in their 50s and 60s today are the ones responsible for all that heinous racist shit that we're dealing with right now. And I'm not pulling any punches on this because this guy was executed in broad daylight by a former DA investigator who thought for sure he could protect himself by immediately calling his DA friend, which would have worked if there was no video. And I think this case encapsulates all of the problems that you have in terms of police misconduct. It demonstrates the systemic racism. It demonstrates not only the belief in that impunity exists, which allows you to do terrible things, but the actual reality of impunity. Impunity, again, means a lack of concern for consequence. You behave as though you're not going to get in trouble no matter what you do. You could say things like, "I could kill somebody in the middle of the street, nobody would arrest me," and that has been proven to be true over and over again, especially in the South. And I'm not pulling any punches because I think we're getting killed by our politeness on these issues. This kind of murderous behavior is not acceptable. It's not tolerable. Tell me what you're thinking when you hear about that. Is that something that resonates with you at all? Or do you think that's just an extreme example, or what are you thinking?
Oh, no, I don't think it's extreme at all. I think it's just something, like you said, that happened to be leaked and then it was presented to the public because this is happening all the time. This isn't an extreme example. They are situations that are happening all over the world exactly to this. And you had referenced, I don't know if we can pull up that article, but the Canadian article about the officers who tried to, for the lawsuit for the assault. Do you remember that one we were talking about? They thought that they were going to be protected by their own people, and then the Crown shot it down. So everyone knows about this within the system itself, whether they're law enforcement or their attorneys or it goes above that. They know that this is true. General population is becoming aware of this now, but like we were talking about, in Canada, there was officers that were upset because the prosecution didn't come forward with the evidence to go against their assault case. They thought they would be protected by their own rules. And
right. The issue that we're talking about in general is qualified immunity. And you and I had this conversation a week and a half or so ago about whether or not qualified immunity was something that existed in Canada. And it's ironic that in the same year that Canada took up the issue of qualified immunity, the United States took up the Supreme Court in the United States took up the issue of qualified immunity again. And as it often does, the Supreme Court of the United States sided with law enforcement. What qualified immunity basically says is that if you are a police officer and you're acting within the scope of your duties and you're performing, if you're on duty, acting in the performance of your duties and you're following proper protocol and following the law as you best understand it, there's a thing called the covenant of good faith and fair dealing. We're going to trust that what the decisions that you made were made in good faith. You weren't trying to do something bad. You weren't trying to hide evidence or lie or do whatever. The problem is qualified immunity has been expanded to take over this idea that law enforcement cannot be held accountable for the things they do while they're on duty. That's what they're, and the law, and specifically not the officer, but the agency. So if you file a lawsuit against a police agency, against an officer, then you are not, the judge can just dismiss it saying, no, they have immunity from any sort of accountability because they were operating within the scope of their office and their official duties. And so the police agency is completely clear. But you might be able to sue the police officer as an individual person. Now, here's the problem with that. There are ways around this that are so simple, but most attorneys don't have the first clue how to deal with it because many of them don't have a desire to actually sue law enforcement agencies or police officers. That's not what they want. The way you demonstrate, and this is for my colleagues out there who might not know better, the way that you demonstrate someone is operating in breach of the covenant of good faith and fair dealing is that they are violating their protocols. If a police agency has protocols for how they're supposed to conduct themselves and how they're supposed to interact with the public, I'll give you a very simple example because this is a big one. Let's talk about body cams. Body cams are so simple. They should just be on, right? No. What do officers do? Officers can flip up a thing and close them so the video goes away. They can deactivate them or they can turn off the mic. Mm-hmm. They can do this on their own without any permission or authority. And when they do that, they're often in violation of their own policies. But it's so constant and common, and they know there's not going to be any punishment for it, and they know no one's going to review those tapes. So they do it anyway. They learn that the consequences are not going to come. So they'll do this.
Yeah. And that's a good point because one of the cases that you just brought me in on, I'm watching the body cams, and the officer was more than willing to have the sound on and the video on when he was following protocol and he was looking through a car and looking for evidence. And as soon as he was walking into the group of police officers, he announced that he thought that somebody was doing something out of pure opinion. There was no evidence. And then he turned off the sound. So I couldn't hear anything after that. There was no conversations. I couldn't hear anything. I could see what was going on, but I was shut out to the audio.
Yeah.
Not helpful. And there's no consequence for it.
They're motherfucking people when they're doing that. What they're saying is, I'm about to say some stuff that I don't want recorded. And the legitimate argument would be something like, it might identify the information related to a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, which is illegal to document and promote and put out there. But that's an internal recording that's not going to be released to the public without editing or without something. So you can actually record it without any real problem. It's just the policy is not to do it because they don't want to be in trouble for it. So I get that. But if you're just turning it off because you want to have a private conversation while on duty, nope. To me, that's a violation. And that's why when you have a body cam issue, you have to have a very specific protocols in place about under what circumstances you are allowed to turn it off. There's actually in Chicago, they were trying to install some rules about turning it off being actually an infraction, a serious infraction. Mm-hmm. You could be demoted or where you could get charged or whatever, because it's happening so frequently. So when you say, oh, we have body cams, it's all there. No, that doesn't mean anything because they can just turn them off or they can flip up the shield and keep it from being recorded.
Yeah. Which on another case, just to say this to the people who are listening, on another case that one of our other associates was looking at, it was during an interview. So when it comes to us at the point where we're supposed to be looking for inconsistencies within interviews or if protocol was followed, all of a sudden magically 3 officers' body cams all failed at the exact same time.
At the exact same time. And then they'll say, oh, it failed. And then the other one, it failed. And if you have one or two, maybe, But all three failing at the exact same minute, nope. That's them
That's a problem.
coordinating shutdown. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't, and that's another way is, and I remember our good friend and colleague, Pat Bucard, who I hope is paying attention. He said one of his pet peeves is that they've learned not to communicate in ways that people understand are documented. And one of the ways they do that is through the EMS system. The EMS system that they have has a chat function where they can send images and back and forth. And there's what they do. What do they do with that? Do they do it to communicate officially? No, of course not. Since nobody knows about it, they use it to send all kind of inappropriate photographs, to text each other for the illicit affairs that they're having amongst officers, all the dirt that they're doing that they're not supposed to be doing. That's what they do with it.
And this is the system you're referring to that is in the cruisers.
That's
correct?
Right. It's in the cruisers,
right.
the EMS, exactly.
These are the personal experiences I was talking about began with that handy piece of equipment.
Let's hear it. Tell us your experience on that, because I think people will be very happy to learn about it.
This is when we're talking about police ethics as an umbrella statement. So my personal experience with police and questionable ethics would be when I was on ride-alongs. I'll give you two specific examples. I'll let the service remain nameless because they know who they are.
They know who they are,
they do.
They know.
Whatever. Anyway, so I'm going on a ride along. So it's a night shift. So I'm 12 hours with an officer, and I get, at the beginning of the shift, I'm told what I'm allowed to do, what I'm not allowed to do, how to get the gun if he's in danger, all of these sorts of things. As the night progressed, apparently I look like the type of person that just doesn't say anything, has no opinion, and just kind of follows suit with everything. So I started to become aware of the way the conversation was changing, and they were letting me in on more of the personal banter between the other officers that were on shift that night. One of the major things that happened a few hours in, it would have been around 1 a.m. or something like that. There was one other female who was on duty that night, and she called an emergency for backup as quickly as we could all arrive there because she was in a physical altercation with somebody who was intoxicated outside of a bar, and it was just them in the parking lot. And she called for us to come. And on that piece of equipment, they all started typing, "Give her 10 minutes, see if she survives." And I said, well, why would you leave her in the parking lot fighting for her life against a man? Because she's giving us all this information really rapidly and really quickly. And they said, because she ratted out someone a few weeks ago, so we need to teach her a lesson. So they were willing to allow this female who was trusting all these people on her shift to have her back and save her life. They left her for 10 minutes. By the time we got there, she had gotten the shit kicked out of her, but she had solved the problem herself. But like the words they're using, like, see if she survives. Let's let her get her ass kicked by this guy before we show up. All of these sorts of things were happening. Not to mention that this same service had a trophy that they would pass around. And the officers, I asked more than one officer. Like I said, I will hear things and then I kind of inquire a little bit to see if it's gossip or not. And there is a trophy that they would pass around for whomever was on shift during a weekend. Had taken the most amount of 18 to 19-year-old girls intoxicated home from the bar and slept with them in the cruiser. So whoever got the most in one weekend got to hold the trophy for the rest of the week. These things are happening, and it's not just one service. I contacted many different people on different services, and I would get answers like, I've heard of this. I'm not involved in it, of course, would be the second sentence, but I've heard of this and it's in all of the services. So these are the things that are happening with the heroes that, I'm at a loss for words. I get really fired up with this.
No, it's good. Topic. And by the way, I want to say, you are not alone in your observations. And we, in the United States, we have the same exact problem. There were two detectives back in 2019 who were essentially found to have had sex with a teenage girl who was drunk in their custody. These guys were named Eddie Martins, 39 years old, Richard Hall, 34. They were accused in 2017 of raping a teenage girl they took into custody for marijuana possession. She was 18 at the time of the incident, and this was in Brooklyn. Now, they were sentenced to 5 years probation each after pleading guilty to official misconduct. because they had, and what they said was this: just because someone's in our custody doesn't mean we can't have sex with them. That was their argument.
What?
Their argument. But the problem is that's completely false. They've arrested somebody. That person can't leave. They're in their care. They're responsible for their health and well-being. The belief that it's okay to have sex, but this is the problem. Too many cops think that this is an entitlement, that this is a perk of the job, is that they're going to encounter attractive drunk females and that they are allowed to have sex with them. And the younger they are, the better it is, because a person who's underage and drinking, that person can't complain without
they can't
getting
say anything. Exactly.
And that's why they like prostitutes. That's why they like teenagers. That's why they like this is like the plot of The Bad Lieutenant, but it exists everywhere.
Yeah. And then I found that there would be one or two females that would then be sought after because it happened to her and she was too drunk to know what was going on. But then the cops would talk about it, and then other cops would show up where they, because these are small towns, right? So people know where each other are. The word gets around, you find out who goes where. So they would show up and wait outside where this girl would be because they knew that they could get away with taking her home because she did it once, and they used it. They victimized her over and over and over. And it was more than one person. Was it ever reported? No. Why? Because they were too drunk and they're labeled as badge bunnies. So it was their fault, right?
Now what's a badge bunny for people who don't know?
Badge bunny are the girls that go after cops, or well, in this specific case, cops. They look for police officers to either have relationships with or have sex with because they are attracted to that status. They call them a badge bunny.
Right.
Now,
and a lot of them collect patches. They identify themselves because they'll show up with all the patches that they've collected, and
they will
by having
and
sex.
That's a different story.
Yeah,
that's a completely different story. Someone goes in that is doing that, even though that's slightly, there's some blurred lines with that as well. But these are girls that they can't even walk, and we think we're safe, right? So we're coming out of the club and we think, well, we'll get a ride home with an officer instead of some random from the bar. And then they end up convincing them to have sex with them in the cruiser and then dropping them off, which spirals into the other problem that I have in Canada, and I'm sure you've heard of it, are the Starlight tours. These are also a major problem, and this dates back to, I think the earliest report was in 1976. It goes back to the indigenous population where police officers were picking up these people and taking them and dropping them off in the middle of nowhere, so they had a long walk back. Now we live in Canada. We have a very cold winter. People were dying. People are going missing. This is still happening today, and it's happening everywhere. It's not just in Saskatoon where this was first reported and originated out of. These are happening everywhere. And now they're like midnight rides. They call them all these different things. There are a few missing person cases that we hold where the last place that the female was seen was at a police district very late at night. My first initial reaction, and it was winter, and she was vulnerable demographic because these girls were drug addicts or prostitutes. And my first initial reaction was, well, where did she go? Who took her home? Did a cop take her home? Did they give her a midnight ride? Like, these things are all happening.
And they don't want,
everywhere.
And that demonstrates the resistance, because even if they didn't do anything wrong, they know this kind of behavior exists. So they know if they investigate too deeply, they might find somebody who gave her a Starlight tour.
Exactly. Yes.
So we have my first thought is, as a person who is not, I've seen this many times. My first thought historically is I'm thinking about the plot to First Blood back in the 80s, where the sheriff takes Rambo and drives him to the edge of town, right? That's the first, because that's a thought. We don't want your type in our town. That's the first thought. Mm-hmm. Second thing is, in Alaska, they had this concept called the blue ticket. A blue ticket is where the police would get you a ticket out of town, so you could leave, but do not come back. We won't arrest you for this crime, but you're an undesirable. We'll give you a blue ticket, which means we're paying for you to leave town and transfer the problem to another city. Mm-hmm. But what you're describing is just driving somebody who's got a medical condition of inebriation or addiction, taking to them, or they're just they're a vulnerable population with some other intersectional issue, and they're driving them far and hoping that they don't make it back. That's the only thing you're doing, hoping they don't make it back, or the belief is you're teaching them a lesson. This tough love nonsense, when you have somebody who's got a crisis in front of you, when you have somebody who's got a medical issue, they're drunk, they're intoxicated, they got an addiction, the cop apparently is the last person you want dealing with, because they think they're their parent, and they think that spanking them socially or physically
Yeah.
is helping them. That's not true at all. That's just being violent. What you're demonstrating is you're a violent aggressor who has no business having contact with the public. You shouldn't be taught. You shouldn't be in the same room alone with somebody
Mhm.
who needs help because you cannot be
Yeah.
trusted. That's all that means. And you
Now,
certainly shouldn't be a police officer.
all of these examples that I gave you are very few of what I witnessed from this
Yes.
particular service. And I did not sit back with this information. I went higher. I
Yes.
went to their superiors and I would ask about these things, and they would just say, "Oh, I wouldn't start asking questions about this." And I said, "Well, shouldn't you be asking questions about this? How is
Yes.
this happening?" Then, after I started asking these questions, I had someone show up at my house who was a sergeant at the time and asked me politely, didn't ask me, told me that if I did not leave this town, nobody would come if I called 911.
Yeah. That's law enforcement loves to do that. They love to threaten that they're going to pull services. And remember,
Yeah.
this is what they did international or nationally, rather, in the States when we were talking about. First, it started off with uh, with the protests at NFL games, right? This
Mhm.
idea, well, if they're going to protest law enforcement brutality at NFL games by taking a knee, like Colin Kaepernick,
Mhm.
we're not going to give security to those venues. Well, let me explain something to you, civil servant, police officer. You don't have a choice when it comes to those things.
Oh.
Well, you do what you're told. You're not a free thinking individual. You work for an agency. If they tell you to go a place, you're going a place. Okay, that's the first thing.
Mhm.
And if you're not, you're going to get fired because your job is to follow orders, not to impose your ideological beliefs. The second thing is, do you think it makes people feel safer that you're going to threaten to impose your ideological beliefs in every context and deprive citizens of the right to protection and to gather and to assemble? And the reason why this matters is because look on the back of your ID card, police officer. What does it say? You took an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States, which means everybody, which means you're protecting all the citizens, not just the ones you like. But our law enforcement in the United States, and this has been demonstrated over and over again, has been infected by white nationalism. Recently, we had a very big we have a very big scandal now where there's been a leak of the names of the roles of people who are in what are called the Oath Keepers, which is a white nationalist group of people who believe in the violent overthrow of the United States by, like-minded patriots.
Mhm.
All right, we're part of the January 6th insurrection. What they found is there's a ton of police officers involved in that organization, and they've leaked the names of all the officers online, so you can go check it out. But the point is, that's who's in our police force: people who are violent. And in some agencies, like in Atlanta, for example, I think most people would be surprised to learn that fully 1/3 of graduates from the Atlanta Police Academy have criminal records. In St. Louis, New Jersey, it's between 10 and 15%. Excuse me, St. Louis, Missouri, it's between 10 and 15%. There is a level of tolerance for criminal behavior that will be allowed in law enforcement or even encouraged because they like bad cop shops like other bad cops. They all tend to
Mhm.
clump together because they attract each other. Because if you get a cop who's got a bad history, they'll keep quiet for you. What this means is if you've got a good agency, then all the good cops are going to go there too. So a lot of what we see is good cops working at good agencies are almost always blind or willfully blind to what's
Mhm.
going on in other agencies. Oh, those guys aren't real cops. No, they're cops too. They have guns and badges and everything. They're just like you. And if you're not speaking out against them every day, then you are saying what they're doing is okay. That's the problem that I have is that cops like to paint themselves with the same broad good guy brush, the good guy hero brush, instead of acknowledging that they have a large percentage of officers who are doing very bad things, violating policies and procedures and protocols in favor of some ideological belief that is usually associated with authoritarianism or white nationalism, and they do not want to acknowledge that they have an obligation or a responsibility to speak up about that. The ones that say that we're the good guys. I mean, there's some bad apples, but no, it's not a bad apple problem. It's a cultural problem. One of the things that reminds me of, and tell me what you think about this. When I think of police officers, I realize that I equate police culture with frat boy culture because
Oh,
that's what I see.
100%.
I see a bunch of
Yeah.
children getting together, doing things they shouldn't do, screwing around on their spouses, lying to
Mhm.
other community, breaking the law, doing all kinds of stuff they shouldn't do and getting away with it. Not in every agency, but in many
No,
agencies. And
in
we
many.
keep
Yep.
And in fact, if you have somebody screaming out loud that they don't do that, if the people, like, for example, this podcast, it's going to get some police officers upset. Good. I hope it does, because usually when people are upset, they're motivated to take action. I like to see good people take action. But the ones who are going to be the loudest, they will actually threaten you. Let's see how many police officers are stupid enough to put their name on a threat to you or I. It will be
Well,
at
and
least.
also, yeah, oh, definitely. And I showed you there was more than one officer. Now, the one officer that reached out to me, I know her personally, so I understood where it was coming from.
Gotcha.
But there were many different police officers that reached out to me when I announced the topic last week.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a lot of, are you sure you want to go down that road?
Be nice.
Be careful what you say. Be gentle.
Why?
And I said, absolutely not. And I would urge the officers, I was thinking about this morning, but the officers who are, their feelings are gonna be hurt when this
Good.
comes across their very sensitive ears.
Very sensitive.
But the ones that are going to be triggered, or they have that fire that is burning within them when they're listening to what we're saying, I would urge them to look at the categories. Exactly. Well, yeah. But are you angry because you know about this and you're not talking about it and you don't want it to affect your position, so you're keeping quiet? Or are you the officer we're talking about?
One of the two.
If you're not in those two categories, feel free to reach out. I might listen. I might read your opinion. I don't know, probably not. But the point is, have some self-reflection here. Because if you're getting angry about it, you're angry about it for more than one reason. This is happening. These are my personal experiences. You can't argue with me about what I saw and what I didn't see, right? So try and argue the point. But where are you coming from?
Yeah. What is
the basis of that?
You're upset? Are you upset?
Exactly.
Most of the time, when I see people getting up, the good cops, quote unquote good cops, when they get upset, it's because they want the benefit of people believing that they're heroes. They want to hear that in their ears all the time. They need it. They're so insecure. They need to be told they're a hero constantly, or they get mad. And for me, that's a psychological problem. It's a problem maybe of addiction. It's maybe a problem related to substance abuse. I see, or it's a mental health problem, because I work in my job every day and I don't need to be screamed at that I'm a hero. I don't require that. That would be in any other context, that's considered to be narcissism and egotism run amok. But in law enforcement, it's considered to be a cardinal trait that is enduring. They get very upset when you don't scream how much of a hero they are. And I think it's so toxic now that it actually, to me, it indicates criminality. If you have an officer who needs that special dispensation all the time, it's because they want to conceal stuff they're doing that's bad. A good police officer, that's the problem. If they actually need to hear that, if they don't like criticism, then they're in the wrong profession. They've never actually been under oath, and they've never actually been taken to task for the things they're doing wrong. Now, what they could argue is, hey, we're not getting enough funding to do this, or we're not getting enough support from leadership to do that. Totally agree. Let's have that conversation. But that's separate from the conversation of hunting down a black man for jogging and shooting them in the back in public, video recording it because you're proud you did it. That is the world that we live in right now. We are seeing officers doing stuff like this. We're seeing former officers. We saw officers storm the Capitol building. We saw officers getting murdered at the Capitol building by ex-military, ex-police. I mean, it's just, to me, it's mind-boggling, and there is no legitimate explanation for accepting or tolerating this kind of criminal behavior from police officers. And I say that because misconduct, again, it generally can be charged as a crime if you want, but only if you want it to be. So we know what the problem is. The problem is we have a hiring. First of all, for me, the problem is we have a hiring problem. We don't hire quality candidates. The second problem is we don't screen those candidates properly. There's supposed to be a series of psychological assessments that are done to make sure that racists and people with mental health issues and addictions don't get put on the police force, and especially people with criminal records, right? That's the second thing. So it's a hiring problem. Then it becomes a retention problem. There's no leadership overseeing these people and making sure that they get kicked out before they become vested, before they start getting their pensions and the golden handcuffs get put on them in terms of being able to not being able to leave. So there's that. But then there also is a question of what do we do with agencies that are not policing themselves, that have corruption from the top down, right? Tell me in your mind, I would love to hear from you on this because I have my own opinions about this, but as a first and primarily as a woman, second as a burgeoning forensic examiner, and as a forensic investigator, what advice would you give to a police agency about how they can address this problem from your perspective? I don't want to hear about my perspective. I want to hear your perspective.
I would, this is a difficult question to answer because there's so many
Yeah,
different levels to it, and it is
totally
not
agree.
a simple, it's not a simple fix. I can speak on the recruitment process though, personally. So
Let's
I
hear it.
understand what the recruitment process is. I went from start to finish through it. I got through to interviews. There is a psych eval that is done at after a few interviews, successful
Yeah.
interviews and things like that. Now, in my experience, this is where it fell apart because they are telling, they are broadcasting to society that they're looking for people with certain education, certain amount of morals, certain ethics, a type of
Yeah.
individual. They're trying to
And it
move
sounds
away
good
from
on
what
paper, right? It looks good on
sounds
paper.
sounds fantastic. Fast forward, I did all of those things. I jumped through all the hoops. I did everything that they requested of me for 7 years. I kept going and saying, what can I do now? What can I do now? I got
Yeah.
all the education. And then it was during all the interviews, it would go back to the complaint that I filed from an officer for a sexual assault. It
Right.
all came back to that. So it falls apart right in front of your eyes because if you are not willing to shut your mouth, they immediately see you as a threat to the organization. So
They need to know you can keep quiet.
right.
That's
And if
right.
you cannot, you don't go through. It doesn't matter if you are mentally stable, if you've done counseling, if you have the education, none of that matters. All they care about is are you going to come in and not talk about the shit you're about to see? That's all it is. So how do we start fixing that? It has to go so far up the chain and nobody's willing to do anything about it,
Well,
right?
in my view, it's the problem is the civilian oversight authority. Civilian authority is either too political or too stupid about the law, the rules, and their role to govern this stuff because all these guys are employed by civilians. And so
Mhm.
the civilian population could just like that make a change. The problem is there's too much political pressure and influence and cultural pressure and influence to not do that, to be, oh, we need to back the blue. Why? Why would you make the blanket statement back the blue? Uh, that makes no sense. What you back is good behavior. You back ethics. If everyone was ethical and competent and honest, then that
Mhm.
makes total sense. But let's say we back that. Let's back the traits and the qualities. Let's back the
Right.
act. Let's back the actions. Let's not say we're going to blanketly support people that we know are engaged in criminal activity, that are doing things they shouldn't do, that are not qualified, or that have committed actual crimes. I got in my hometown, former hometown of Sitka, Alaska. Um, I still run my business out of there, but I don't spend as much time as there as I should or like. But the reality is that police agency, I've seen it going through several iterations. I'm responsible for actually removing 2 chiefs of police and several lieutenants of operation in that department because of my complaints, allegations, and investigations over the last 20 years. And the last one they hired to replace everybody, they did the same thing they always do. They hire somebody with no real experience being in a command position, someone who has questionable ethics because they look good on paper, someone who will follow orders. And I say they, I mean the city assembly or the city administrator who's a politician. And then that person, that new chief, they brought in a guy who was their best friend who had been fired from the previous agency for crashing a car while he was drunk and then lying about it. This is not, and this guy is put in charge of the operations of the police department. So now you have the director of operations is a convicted criminal, a known drunk, and all the cops underneath them now are supposed to what? Think that, oh, this is a good place to work now? No, the turnover rate is still like 90% per year. Nobody wants to stay working there. And anybody who does want to stay working there, it's because they got their own problem. We got a guy who works in the jail who killed somebody. He got arrested for murder, put on trial, and acquitted by a racist jury for killing a native kid. And then later, fast forward, 30 years, he actually was involved in tasing the Hugendorf kid, Frank Hugendorf, who's a native kid. The systemic racism is a problem. The actual way that law enforcement hires and retains is a problem. And the frat boy culture of impunity is a problem. And I don't think that until you solve those things, you're going to change law enforcement. And I will say this very clearly. You could replace the law enforcement agency in Sitka, Alaska with an answering machine. And I think it would be more effective for the community. That then, and you joke, we laugh about that, but there are native communities that don't have police agencies. They have to wait. They have a crime. They got to wait 2 or 3 days to have somebody who's a police officer or a state trooper fly in sometimes for weather to come in and investigate. You could replace it with an answering machine and it would be just as effective, and there'd be less problems. There'd be less liability for the city. If you had a good police agency with good hiring practices and good leadership, that would be great. When you got a bad one, that's just all you're doing is creating liability, as far as I'm concerned. I wish that the belief was that the goals were the same. So when you and I talk about what the goals of law enforcement ought to be, it's about investigating crime. It's about protecting citizens and property. It's about being responsive. It's about making sure that people feel safe in the community. But it's mainly about being responsive and being honest about what's going on. Instead, it becomes about how law enforcement looks in the newspaper,
Right.
how their image is perceived, because the role of the chief is political. So they only care about that, and they're the ones who give the orders. So they're the ones dictating who and whether and when things get done, by whom and how. You know what I mean? It's whole process political. So as long as there's a political element involved, as long as there's interference on that level, as long as they're hiring and retaining the wrong people and they're valuing the wrong things, I don't see that it can change right away. There has to be stronger civilian oversight. Go ahead.
That's right. And what I see here happening is they will, this was OPP specifically, but when they were talking about hiring people with certain degrees and trying to change the image and hire better qualified people, they put 3 people in the newspaper. We hired 3 people on the OPP, and they have a criminology degree or a psychology degree. But do you know how many people are hired at once? And you're telling me 3 of them have a degree? Great. But what about the 80 other ones that you hired? Tell us more about them, because I can tell you right now, they're not those people that you're putting into the media to calm everybody's nerves around here.
Well, right? let's talk about that, because I think that's really good. We're gonna have to wrap up here in a second. We got only a few minutes left, but I think you raise a very important issue, and that's the issue of education. If you have someone who's educated, they are a better police officer, and the reason why is because they're more broadly knowledgeable about issues and concerns that the community has. They're more broadly knowledgeable about the historical influences. They're more broadly knowledgeable about the solutions that they can bring to bear as a police officer. They have a better philosophy. They have a better access to information. Law enforcement as a community, however, does not like formal education or higher education. It hates it because they don't like the criticism that comes from it. They're so insecure, they can't handle criticism. Every other job, every other workplace environment has a critical review process to make you better. Law enforcement is one of those ones that does not want to have that. It hates it. They're like, we'll be happy to internally talk about things and keep them private, so long as publicly there are parades and people are screaming that they're heroes all the time. If they stop hearing those screams about how they're heroes, they get really upset. And that's a problem of education. So from my point of view, the real problem isn't, and that's not even the issue. The issue is the kind of education they get. The criminal justice programs and the criminology programs, they draw from the lowest level of high school graduates. So they're not competitive programs. They're just designed to help people who couldn't really survive in a regular college environment, get them a degree so they can get a job working in corrections or law enforcement. And so even those degrees are not that great, depending on the program they go to. What has to be embraced is real education, reading, thinking, reasoning, instead of aggression. I believe we have to shift the law enforcement model from one of the aggressive, hyper steroid abusing, roid rage warrior to the peace officer, who actually, when they come into a situation, they're there to make things better, to de-escalate, to take the high levels of emotion and high level of violence and potential violence in the environment and bring it down. If they haven't got that capacity, to my mind, they have no business responding to calls. If all they're going to do is bring danger and aggression to a call, then they're not really serving as a good police officer. They're serving as an agitator, as a provocateur. A lot of officers see that as their role. When I give training to police officers, which happens at least once a month, I'm in front of a group of police. And the first thing I say is, when you are responding to a call, what's your role? Are you there to get your gun off? Are you there to pull your gun or to bang some heads, to mete out to give people a lesson? Or are you there to help? When people see you coming, what do they see? Do they see you as a person who's going to make things better? Or do they see you as someone who's going to make things worse? And that to me is all about
Yeah.
identity. A lot of
And
cops, they
you
get the question because their desire is to go in and,
definitely.
you know,
And you raised a very interesting point, because that I can give you an example again from
Sure.
the recruitment process for myself. When I'm applying and I had my paralegal degree,
yeah,
that was suitable. They liked
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Then, because it was taking years and years, I thought, look, I'm going to keep furthering my education, because they keep saying if you have a
yeah,
higher degree, you'll be more desirable. So I did a bunch of certificates through the police services
yeah.
website themselves. So all of their stuff. And then I did a post university course with you, and I suddenly became too educated and my ethics were too high. So they weren't looking for the education they're looking for. They're exactly what you stated. They want the lower level education. And guess who took my place? I got through a couple of interviews and it was questioned. My
Yeah.
education was questioned a lot, and they were saying that I would have too much to say when I got to the police college because of my level of education. So the person that they hired in my place was a 22-year-old 6-foot white guy that just got out of police foundations. No other
He was there
experience,
based
nothing.
on his size.
Exactly. And he was malleable, right?
Yep. There's a really great, there's a really great case that came out of Connecticut while I was there. While I was in Connecticut, I was what I was doing was getting my degree in forensic science, my master's degree. But while I was there was a corrections officer who tried to become a police officer, and he had to sue the agency he applied to because they told him his IQ was too high. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court in Connecticut. And basically, they said if an officer has too high of an IQ, it is true that the police agency shouldn't hire them. They have the right to say no. And the reason why is because you need someone to make the donuts. Let me explain. The belief is that being the first 4 years of police are going to be on patrol, and you're going to be miserable and you're going to be bored. And intelligent people with a bachelor's degree can't put up with that. They need stimulation. They need to be learning. They need to be thinking. They need to be reasoning. And they ask questions. People who do not have that education, who are just indoctrinated into the sort of the cultural beliefs and attitudes by a police instructor working at the university level, those people are just fine because they're going to be malleable. They're going to have the admiration. They're going to live with this admiration and desire to get the approval of authority without thinking, without questioning. And there's the analog is people work for Dunkin' Donuts. You want to hire people who are not that smart, people who are not that ambitious, who can put up with the long hours of boredom and make donuts. And that's what I was talking to a police officer, a police chief one time in Connecticut about this. And he said, we need to hire people. We need people who are willing to make the donuts. And people who are too educated do not want to make the donuts. They don't want to come in early. They don't want to put in the hard work. And they ask a lot of questions. We need people who are willing to make the donuts without question. And that's the law enforcement community that we have. So IQ requirements are actually in place, or not IQ, but there's like these different tests, these aptitude batteries that they take that will give a level that will demonstrate the level of intelligence. And if it's too high, they will not hire you because you're going to ask questions, because you're going to know the law. You're going to know, you're going to question, you're going to know when you're being given an illegal order. And you're going to be smart enough not to make up laws on the spot. One of my biggest pet peeves are law enforcement officers who, when they are looking to harass or intimidate someone, they make up a law claiming a law has been violated. They might even arrest somebody for a law that doesn't exist. And then they have to kick them loose later. But it's merely to teach the person a lesson. And what's the lesson? Do what you're told when law enforcement tells you. That is not okay. That's an authoritarian state. The police are civil servants. They work for the community. They are not jackbooted thugs, even if they want to be. Even if they want to be, those kind of people have no business in law enforcement. But we have to weed them out one at a time. I believe firmly that the role of a good justice system is to identify those kinds of police officers and kick them to the curb. They're going to get in. So we just have to have mechanisms by which we can keep them out or kick them out.
Right. Yeah.
And that means first acknowledging the tendency, the patterns and practices of agencies that are allowing these kinds of people into law enforcement. Well, last thoughts from you. Tell me what you're thinking as we're closing up here. What's the final message you'd like to get out, or the final words you'd like to say on this issue in terms of not even a resolution, but your takeaway and what you tell people?
What I tell people about what?
About police misconduct in terms of when someone
goodness.
asks, what's a problem and what should we do? It's a problem.
it is a problem. I want everyone to just be aware and start to pay attention that this
Yeah.
is a problem. Because if we all start talking about it, and maybe there's a hope that something's going to be done, right? Right now, I feel like it's slight, but if we keep pressing the issue and things are being brought to the surface, I feel like we can start moving in a better direction, even if it's just one officer at a time, right? The ones that need to be weeded out. We have to figure out a system in order to keep these people out so we don't have the same problem.
The other thing, and I want to add to what you just said because I think it's so great. What you're talking about is the normalization of police misconduct. We have normalized it to the point where we just think it's part of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
We have to stop that. It's like saying domestic violence
Yeah.
is part of any marriage or intimate relationship. It's not. It's violence. It's a crime. Do not normalize violence in your home, and do not normalize the violence of the state. The law enforcement has no right, no authority, and no uh, rationale for inflicting some of the violence that they do on people that have not committed a crime and are not suspicious for committing a crime, when it's often just ideological or based on the disposition of the officer in the day. What I love is when captains or chiefs, they like say, "Oh, I have to apologize for this officer. He's going through a hard time. He's going through a breakup. He's going through a divorce. He just lost this or he just had that happen." Doesn't matter. If that's the problem, then he needs to go home and not be a cop while these things are going on.
Right.
So I think I'd like to leave it there and just say that the problem is we have this problem. We've normalized it. We need to unwrap it, unpackage it, and do what you said, which is to keep talking about it, not angrily, but honestly.
Yeah.
Be honest. Don't need to exaggerate, but talk honestly about what's going on. The Ahmaud Arbery case, like I said, is a prime example of just how ugly law enforcement can get. Now, it's good that these guys are now on trial for this murder that they committed in broad daylight and happily recorded, but it happened. It's still, somebody's dead. It still happened. They only did it because they thought they would get away with it. And if there hadn't been a cell phone video, and if that video had not been leaked to the public, they would have gotten away with it. So that's where I'd like to leave it. Any last thoughts, or are you good?
I'm good.
All right. It is so good to speak with you about these things, and I really appreciate your perspective. And I hope that we can get back on schedule. My fault.
Sure.
We always have scheduling problems, but you know what? We overcome.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much. If you are interested at all, you can see our podcast, The Hard Truth, on Spotify. This episode will be uploaded in a day or two. Okay. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good afternoon. If you have any comments or questions, please send them to us. We're happy to, and the death threats too. We're happy to have those too.
Whatever. Send them.
Always. But if you don't sign your name, we know you're a coward. It's okay. All right. Everyone take it easy.